Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amy Galpin, and I'm the Chief Curator at the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum. Before beginning, we acknowledge that the territory now known as South Florida has been the traditional homeland of Native nations, including the Calusa, the Tequesta, and today the Miccosukee and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. We invite viewers to pay their respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders of the past and of the present. Today, our program features a conversation with artist John William Bailey. I invited John to join us today because of the many intersections with his work and a current exhibition on view at the Frost Art Museum of the archive of Roberto Obregón. First, I would like to share with you a little bit about John William Bailey. He is a French-American artist born in the UK. He received his MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale University and has been a faculty fellow of the Honors College at Florida International University since 2004. His work explores history and culture with an emphasis on transatlantic dialogue. His paintings explore the question of how we are who we are in relationship to history, place, and culture. John's works have been exhibited at the University of Maine, the Frost Art Museum, the Ringling Museum of Art, Texas State University, as well as other venues in the US and France. John is currently an artist in residence at the Deering Estate. Please join me in welcoming John Bailey. When you come to the Frost Art Museum right now and you see the work of Roberto Obregón, you're looking at an artist who engages in global conceptualism, an artist who had an incredible passion for the rose. He dissected it in a pseudo-scientific manner. He dismantled its kitsch aesthetic, and he obsessively numbered a small set of roses, reproducing them in different ways. Through photography, here you're looking at a rubber mural currently on view in our galleries. Born in Barranquilla, Colombia, Roberto Obregón lived much of his life in Venezuela and, for more than a decade, focused on the rose. On the left-hand corner of your screen, you see a profile of Roberto Obregón. This image repeats in the exhibition. The presence, the human presence of the artist is with us. One of the things that I find very intriguing about the work of John Bailey is the ongoing presence, his own presence, the ongoing presence of his lived experiences, his daily life in his rigorous painting practice. So John, welcome. One of the first things I want to start with is your body of work that was recently on view at the L&S Gallery, The Roses of Fibonacci. And I wondered if you could talk about the role of nature in your work and specifically your evocation of the rose.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Just a sound check first. Okay. So the use of the rose in my painting relates back to a Roman myth where a emperor was having a feast, and at one point in the feast, he pulls back the canvas to a ceiling and roses fall down onto his guests. And there are so many of them that they actually suffocate some of the guests. Although that Roman story is one of decadence, what caught me in that story was this idea that a type of judgment or of retribution can come from nature, that the beauty of nature can also, in a sense, violent. And it often is when one spends time in nature. And I've thought about that specifically with Miami in relationship to our history of climate change and specifically hurricanes, that we do certain things to the landscape and then it comes back and there's a correction from nature. So the roses of Fibonacci presents the flora as, in a sense, a similar type of power that you see in many medieval and Renaissance paintings of a Last Judgment, this divine force that comes and in a sense sets things straight. So, and then it's also, they are arranged in Fibonacci spirals intentionally to question whether or not this is inevitable if our actions are part of a larger pattern. We often think that nature is spontaneous and unpredictable, intuitive, or whatnot, when there is a cause and effect, correct? And so that these judgments that we get from nature are, in a sense, part of a spiral that, because we are in the Fibonacci spiral or the Fibonacci sequence, we cannot see the sequence, but it is so large that actually our actions and their consequences are inevitable. And so in all these paintings, you see figures basically in conflict with the flora, whether it be the roses or the mangroves.
I know that mangroves appear a lot in your work, and I've heard you talk about the entanglement, like the physical entanglement of mangroves, also as a metaphor for the history of this land and this space. Can you talk a little bit specifically about why the mangrove is a leitmotif in your work? So
there are several specific reasons why the mangroves appear over and over in my work. The environmental one because for me, the painting is a result of my lived life and what I see around me. And I'm always out in the bay on a kayak or swimming, or I'm hiking in different parts of nature in Miami. And what you see is that the skeleton that holds Miami together are the mangroves. The mangroves are the skeleton of Miami. And that was very interesting to me because I would always draw them when I'm drawing the landscape. But then when I thought of this notion of, in a sense, a divine judgment coming from nature, I thought that mangroves would be the perfect image for this, symbol for this, because they are I thought of the great work, the classical work, Laocoon and his sons were the Trojan priest displeases the Greek gods, and he is absorbed, and he and his sons are entangled by serpents and dragged back into the sea and drowned. And I thought the mangroves could act in this way as well. And so in the painting that you see here, there are several figures that are constantly being intertwined and suffocated by mangroves that are this kind of, this dark force. And in the drawing, you can see that there are mangroves over the Colosseum, and that they go beyond even just the figures, and they become a symbol of nature reclaiming itself throughout the world. And then there's another thing, which is a very conscious decision that we talked about, Amy, is that as a person that really sees the paintings that influence me are really Italian, Spanish, and French paintings are what influenced me the most. And I looked at those, and in the landscapes, in those paintings, the figures are in a sense placed in the landscape. You have a little tableau, a little setting, and then you just place the figure in there, and they're separate from the landscape often. That's not how we are in Miami. In Miami, we are consumed and absorbed by the landscape. We are surrounded by it. Just go hiking at the Deering Estate, and you're not walking in nature, you're part of it. realized that the look of the mangroves, since there are no mangroves in Europe, doesn't really appear in those paintings. So I also had a conscious decision, like I can have a compositional component here that has not really been seen in European paintings so much. I'm sorry, I'm giving too long-winded questions.
No,
Answers.
no, not at all. That's really great. And I think it's helpful for our viewers today to also understand the underpinning of your work in the traditions of European painting. Currently at the Frost, accumulate, classify, preserve, display is the title of the Obregón exhibition. One of the very striking aspects of the presentation of your show at the LNS Gallery was your choice to collaborate with Sofia Guerra, curator and recent graduate of FIU, in also presenting your archive, your archival materials in print study room drawers that people could open and experience in the galleries. So just for everyone watching, this is the Obregón show at the Frost Art Museum. And this is part of John's recent exhibition at the LNS Gallery. And you're looking at an image of the project space at the gallery. Can you talk about the choice to present your drawings and the collaboration with Sophia?
So I first met Sophia as a student in one of my classes, and I have students work with me as interns regularly. And as Sophia is an art history major, she began working with me at the Deering Estate. And we had this project room to think about for this exhibition. And what happened is that my process is complex. So every painting you see has several studies, and there's research that I do. I do readings, I do drawings of drawings of drawings. I take those to Office Max, I photocopy them all, then I draw on top of that. So there's this long process. And Sophia is very interested in the process of making art. And so she started organizing the studies that I had made that really were just in different piles everywhere. And her idea was to organize these in these flat files so that people could open these flat files and actually understand the process. So what was neat about it, since we're all FIU here, you and I, is that here was a student that had never curated an exhibition before, or part of an exhibition, that had the opportunity, thanks to Sergio and Luisa of LNS, to curate this exhibition and then present it to the public, and in a sense, launch her curatorial career. And to me, that was fantastic. As an aside, just from a professor artist side, is to have a student go from being a student to being a curator. And since then, she became first curatorial assistant at the Deering Estate, and now she's a full-time employee at the LNS Gallery. And so that's an ideal scenario for me as far as seeing the development of a student. And she's curated the exhibition that I have right now as well.
That's incredible. I didn't know that about the current exhibition. That's really nice to know. And I know a number of students are joining us today, some of your current students, but also students at FIU who haven't yet had the pleasure of taking classes with you. And so I really encourage you to also look into Professor Bailey's courses, and you will learn so much about Miami and about contemporary art and much more. One of the connections with the exhibition is poetry. For Obregón, he titles one of the bodies of work, one of his series, about the rose, The Sick Rose, and it's a reference to a poem by William Blake. You're seeing one of the sort of manifestations of the sick rose on the left. The Sick Rose by Obregón evolved out of a gift. His friend, the artist and writer Luis Salmerón, gave him a rose, and he kept it. Eventually, bugs also ate some of the petals. But very sadly, Luis died due to complications of AIDS. And Obregón became very, I guess it's fair to say, obsessive about the idea of the metaphor of life through the rose, the notion of bodily decay, and the life cycle through the way in which a rose changes over time. And I've always been taken, John, with your ongoing collaboration with the poet Richard Blanco, who I know wrote a poem for your exhibition, The Roses of Fibonacci. He also, before the poem, evokes Jose Marti, evoking the rose. And I wondered if more broadly you can talk about, these many years of collaboration between you and Richard Blanco, and how his writings have informed your work, and vice versa too.
Oh, absolutely. Well, first, I love that Obregón, the Sick Rose piece. It's beautiful. I love that piece. So Richard and I have been friends for nearly 30 years, and we used to have gatherings at my house where we would do a lot of really irresponsible things, but we would also show new paintings, people would sing, and Richard one night decided to read a poem. It was the first time he ever read a poem to an audience, albeit it was a very small and informal one. And aside from, if I did not know Richard and have that personal connection, it wouldn't matter so much, because his poetry, to me, as a painter, I'm very bad with words. I cannot express my thoughts and my doubts about something in words. I think images, that's why images work for me. It's the way that I can try to get my message out. But with Richard, I would read his poems and they'd be so profoundly personal about him and his experience in relation to Cuba and Spain and Miami. But I would read my story. I would see myself as Richard. I was in my relationship with France and the US, and I'd read his poems and I'd be like, how does this guy know what my life is like better than I do? And then Richard and I had the idea in 2006 to work together, to collaborate on something called Place of Mind. And our collaboration was such that he would never describe one of my paintings and I would never illustrate one of his poems, but rather we would work on common themes. And those common themes were really had to do with place and identity. And so that's why he got Place of Mind. And throughout the years, we have just continued to collaborate. We even taught together at FIU for a few years. And his words are, to me, they're defining of our experience in Miami, but they're also an inspiration to me. And so we go back and forth, and he, yeah.
That's great. And I didn't realize it was 30 years. That's really extraordinary and wonderful.
Yes.
And there's so many more collaborations, I think, in the future between the two of you. It was really hard to pick a work to focus on today, but I found myself drawn to Venice, Venezuela, as an example of this manifestation that I see across many of your works of layering of place, history, and literally paint. Can you share a little bit about the factors that led to the creation of this painting, Venice, Venezuela?
Certainly. So as part of my responsibilities at FIU is that I'm the faculty director of Italy Study Abroad. So for 10 years, a decade up until COVID, I would take students from FIU to Venice particularly. And Venice, to me, is it's an absolutely fascinating city. And the more I learned about it, the more I loved it. There are some places that you go back to another time and it's just not as good as that first time you went, that sense of discovery. But Venice, every time, becomes more powerful. And then one year I was there and my program assistant, Stephanie Sepulveda, was from Venezuela. And she goes, oh, by the way, I never told you this story, but the name Venezuela came from Amerigo Vespucci Venice, I mean, of what is now Venezuela, I'm sorry, Amerigo Vespucci going along the coast of what is now Venezuela and seeing houses on stilts. And he goes, oh my gosh, that's like a small Venice. It's like a Venezuela. And when she told me this, like my mind was blown because first of all, I had no idea that the name Venezuela came from that. But then I also imagined somebody living on that land and then being told just by some offhand remark from this Italian from Florence, saying like, this is Venezuela. And for somebody has been there for millennia, for these people like, oh, you live in a land called Venezuela, and it's now, you know, from this country, Spain, that it would be an explosion of their world, right? So that, what do you mean we're called Venezuela? What do you mean we are part of Spain? And so this idea that identity is tied to language, but this language comes in such a haphazard way and makes reference to a city that the inhabitants are not aware of, for me, made a profound reflection on the transatlantic dialogue. And so it's hard to see, but there's a medieval map of Venice, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. That took me forever to paint. It is historically accurate on a map of Venice from the 1500s. Like every little building, I'd have this much left, and I said, okay, I'm gonna finish today, and I wouldn't. But then in the plume of smoke in the middle, there's a figure that is like this. You can see there, I can't point, right in the bottom of the white, there are hands, and there's this guy holding, yeah, there's a circle. Yeah, you can see the hands there in black, and the world is exploding. And that plume of smoke is basically everything changing in that moment. And then another thing is that one year I finished lecturing. My last lecture really is in the Basilica San Marco in Venice, which is to me one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. And I was exhausted. I was so tired. It was just a month of lecturing throughout Italy with ups and downs. And I was up on the balcony above the main floor of the church, above the apse. And I looked to my side and I saw the stained glass right here, and the light was coming in from the outside and hit it, and it was glittering. And I thought, I want to paint that glittering light. How do I do that in paint? You know, they have it in a mosaic. And then I thought, I'm going to do it not with the gold that I see in Venice, but with the blues that I see in Miami. And whenever you see the sea and the sky in Miami, they kind of glitter and mix into one. You look at the water and the sun's reflecting on it and you can't really see. And so the blues that I painted there was that. And that explosion is the contact between the two worlds. The setting, however, is the new world because of the blues. And Venice lands almost as a spaceship onto this indigenous person that is in this plume of smoke. And I want to add to this that I do this not in an anachronistic, judgmental manner. Like, look at all these terrible things that have happened. I definitely engage those. But I myself was born in Europe and came to the US, or came to this hemisphere at the age of 10. I myself am a white male European that has come to this hemisphere and made it my home without really being aware of the traditions and the peoples that were here before. So these paintings are also self-critical. They are critical of these things, but they're not in an anachronistic pointing of the finger. They're a self-reflection that I am part of this historical trend as well. And I am, as in a sense, as implicated as Amerigo Vespucci is.
I think that's a great moment to transition also to this earlier work. In many of your works, you've demonstrated an interest in examining the history of these lands and the people who lived here. And I wonder if you could share with us more about your painting Tequesta Mound and how more broadly Amerindian history has informed your recent work.
So there are a few things that have greatly influenced me. The first and foremost is I became an artist in residence at the Deering Estate. Probably the first time was about 4 or 5 years ago. And I really was, I was probably as informed as Ponce de Leon was about the Tequesta and the history of the indigenous people of this land. I really knew very little. And going to the Deering Estate, which has the oldest archaeological site in all of southeastern Florida, the Cutler Fossil Site, where they found evidence of human activity up to from 10,000 years ago, and also having one of only 2 unexcavated Tequesta burial mounds in the entire world. Also, they have a Tequesta midden where there are artifacts of their daily lives. On my shoulders and in my mind, I was constantly thinking about it, and I was thinking about how detached I was from it and how problematic that was for me. Because we have different types of ancestors, right? So we have, in a sense, our blood ancestors, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandmother, great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, all this. Then we have our cultural ancestors, whether they are, in many of our cases in Miami, it's dual. So I have my French ancestors. I feel like the French soccer team, that is my team. I don't know any of the guys, but like I live that. But then the US also, if I'm abroad and I see somebody from Miami, like that, we're one, like we have these ancestors. But then there's another one that I hadn't thought about so much, which is geographic ancestors. So they have a different culture. We don't have a bloodline, but they were in a sense, the keepers of the land that we now occupy. And for example, in Rome, ancient Rome and present day Rome, there's really no blood link between them, but you tell a contemporary Roman that they're not tied to classical Rome and they will be completely outraged. And so I realized that for me, I wanted to develop my connection with my geographic ancestors, that in this case are the Tequestas. The Tequestas are the people that were here for really about 3,000 years before Ponce de Leon appeared in Biscayne Bay in 1513. And so that really started inserting itself into my work, which then manifests itself, of course, in broader ideas like the Venice, Venezuela. But in this case, there is one of the only unexcavated burial mounds in the world at the Deering Estate. And I've hiked there so many times, and I sit there and I contemplate it, and I think about what life was like before the alterations that we've seen, and realize that these are all of our people. I was born in the UK. I lived in France until I was 10. But the Tequestas are my geographic ancestors, and they need to be recognized and celebrated as the people that were the keepers of this land for us. And so my paintings are dual. In a sense, they're a dual purpose. They are just a self-examination of my connection to the Tequesta, but they are also an attempt to engage other people in that reflection and that awareness. And then this has developed even more because of the class that I now teach called Miami in Miami, which is essentially a study abroad structured class, but of Miami for students that live in Miami. And pre-Columbian history is an incredibly important component of this, and there's a lot more of it here than we realize.
definitely. We do have a question for you from the audience, and I want to encourage all of our attendees to write questions in the Q&A. The question comes from Andrea Rodriguez, and she writes that Obregón has a very scientific approach. You know, he's about this dissection of the petal and this classifying and cataloging of roses. Andrea asks about the influence of mathematics in your work. Do you use mathematics in your approach to the spirals of roses of the Fibonacci? And I'm also thinking about other ways in which your work involves both science and math through the use of paint. Could you elaborate, please?
Yes. So I am very much rooted in the history of art. I love it. I mean, everything from you know, like a pyramid to Duchamp's fountain. I find it all fascinating. I was looking at traditional compositional formulas, and these compositions were primarily based on triangles, spirals, the golden mean, things like that. And then I realized that we have far more complex mathematical patterns that have been invented in these traditional compositions. And I decided, why don't I try to get some of these more complex mathematical compositions into the paintings? So it started with that, and I did a bunch of drawings of just numbers. But as I was researching this, I came across what to me was the most compelling idea in contemporary mathematics, which is math invented or discovered? So when we see mathematical patterns in nature, are we projecting that formula onto it, or is the formula inherent in nature and are we discovering it? And that question was huge because it goes to the very notions of what does a deity exist? Does God exist? Is there an order, an underlying order to the universe or not? And I started putting numbers in all these paintings, first for just compositional reasons, but then because it asked the biggest of all questions: does our life have a pre-existing structure or not? Do we have free will? Does God exist? And one of the things I never do when people ask me about the numbers is explain them. When I show the paintings, I just I just put numbers in it because the numbers, interestingly, are the most subjective part of the paintings as far as audience response. And I love that people go with it in different directions. The second part of that is research. I do a lot of research, but it's not in any way scientific. It's completely intuitive and selective. So as I'm looking at something, I'll be reading something and something will just take my interest and I'll just go with that and neglect the rest because I'm in no way attempting to be objective or scientific in my paintings. They are personal reflections on broader historical movements. And I definitely want to retain my subjectivity and the openness for the viewer to have their subjectivity to the work. So the research and there aren't really statements of facts in the paintings. They are more broader reflections.
Another question from our audience comes from Lionel Brito, and he asks how COVID has impacted your practice and how the pandemic has maybe shaped your ability to do your work.
Yeah, so it's going to be an answer that is probably completely different than most artists' impact from COVID. Mine was, as a French citizen, I was able to go to France in July, and my study abroads were canceled. So I had the summer open for the first time in a decade. And I went to France and I was able to go to the Louvre when no one was there. to the Musée d'Orsay when it was empty. And I got to see all these great works without all of the people around. And Amy, it was like a punch in the gut in how great these paintings are. And to be able to be stripped away from all of the hype and drama and everything else around the painting, just to reduce it to looking at the painting, I realized how terrible my paintings were. And then I was in France, in Lyon, and I set up a studio. My family still has a lot of roots in Lyon. And I was able to paint while going to the Musée des Beaux-Arts of Lyon, which is an incredibly wonderful and underrated museum. So I would go there in the morning or the afternoon, and then I would come back and paint. And it's really different when you can go and see in person a Rubens or a Poussin or a Monet or a Picasso, and then go back and paint that same day. That's not something that we can do here in Miami. And so for me, the situation as a result of COVID ended up being the most direct connection with painting that I've had in a long time. And it transformed my work. It pushed me so much further. And I never want to be comfortable with my paintings. I never want to repeat the paintings. I want something to be pushing me to do something different. And that situation really did it. And it's this weird thing because COVID is just such an absolutely global tragedy. But in our lives, it also has created situations that were inconceivable 2 years ago. And that one for me, it was something I'll remember for the rest of my life, that summer of painting.
Definitely. And what an incredible experience to be at the Louvre almost by yourself and to be immersed in those paintings. And certainly I think the pandemic has changed so many ways in which we work. For example, even us having this program virtually as opposed to in person and in the galleries. But with that being said, we are very fortunate that you are at your gallery, LNS Gallery, that represents you. And I was really thrilled that you offered to give us a preview of a new body of work called The Flower Wars, which I find the title incredibly intriguing in its evocation of warfare in central Mexico before the arrival of the Spanish. I wondered if this would be a good moment maybe for you to turn the camera around and
Yes.
a little bit about your new body of work, The Flower Wars.
Okay, so I'm going to, it'll take me just a second. So if you want to fill the dead time while I switch.
I'll talk a little bit about
right.
the actual Flower Wars, which occurred from about 1450 to 1519 in central Mexico. Something I always like to share with students is that when the Spanish arrived, it's not as though the Mexica or the Aztec were a completely unified empire and that everyone thought that they were great. And in fact, there was a lot of conflict in central Mexico. And the Mexica was warring with Huejotzingo, Cholula, Tlaxcala, all states now in or areas of central Mexico. And one thing that existed was the Flower Wars. And they would happen on specific days. They would plan, we will meet on this day at this time to engage in battle. And in many ways, they were tied to spiritual belief systems. They were very ritualistic in this idea of this like planned war. And I know John is switching over to his phone now, so he can more easily move around the gallery space. I've also included here some websites where you can learn more about John and his work, and some images on the screen of him interacting, of course, with students.
Okay, wait. Do you see me? Because I don't see myself.
We do.
Okay. All right, hold on. But for some reason, I don't see myself. Hold on, let me get Sophia to help me here. Oh, okay. So, okay, wait, this. Wait, this here. I know. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. So I'm at the LNS Gallery, which is in Coconut Grove. You can come and visit this. And I have a focus exhibition, which is basically, there's a focus gallery in the back. And we do, we do essentially smaller exhibitions of recent works. And so this is Flower Wars, curated by Sofia Guerra. And one of the things that I have to say is that, wait, if I do share screen. Yeah. Okay, all right. Okay, so I actually, when I was, I'll tell you a quick story about how this is important to me. When I was at Yale for graduate school, between when I came down for my first Christmas break, and I had met this new friend, his name is Alfredo Gishov. And I needed to get back to the airport to fly back to New Haven. And Alfredo was like, oh, I'll take you, which was very generous of somebody I just met. And he said, well, I need to pick up my mother because she's flying in. So we go there, we pick up his mother, we all have coffee together. And she goes, hi, Alfredo, I need you to drive the car from Miami to Mexico City this summer. And he's like, oh, okay. And I said, oh, I'll go with you, even though we had known each other just for a little while. And I went. And that was the first of several months that I spent in Mexico, and I painted there. And I like to say that Alfredo is now an accomplished painter in Boston, and we are still friends. But so this was okay. Hold on. All right. So, Sophia had a brilliant idea. So these paintings then make reference to that pre-Columbian history, which I think in Mexico is just an absolutely fabulous culture. And what these do is, again, it's the transatlantic dialogue. And so here, what you have is, you have pre-Columbian deities over European cities. And for example, this one here, you have a European deity over the American landscape. And this is to make sure that people understand that the transatlantic dialogue is not a one-way street. People always see it as Europe coming into the Americas, but also there are so much going back from the Americas into Europe. And this one here is Persephone over the Cutler fossil site. So you have 20 small paintings like this. Here you can see, this is Florence, and you can see right there, the Duomo of Florence. They're again, historically accurate. And then over here, this is a large painting that I've made recently. And this is Persephone de Miami. So this is the incredible deity that spends half the year on the earth and half of the year in the underworld. And she is, in a sense, life and death. And I thought, what a great figure to summarize our time today. And so here, Persephone is passing from the world into the underworld. And the underworld here is the Cutler fossil site, which again is the archaeological site at the Deering Estate, which has the oldest signs of human habitation in all of southeastern Florida. And so this is the Cutler fossil site. And when you go in there, you kind of, it's a little bit of a reach, but you kind of feel the presence of the dead that come back to life. And so I put skulls that you can see here, maybe close in on them, Sophia. You see skulls in the underworld at the Cutler fossil site. But these skulls, I have drawn them. They're based on drawings that I did in the Capuchin crypt from Rome. So again, it's the two different places coming together. And if you look, there's a tip of the hat to Botticelli's Primavera painting, where the flowers, the life is coming out of Persephone's mouth, and it actually goes in a loose Fibonacci spiral that goes all the way around. And again, what ties it together are these mangroves. And then over here, you have the studies that I make for these paintings. So when you see one of my paintings and you see a figure in it, or you see mangroves, the mangroves are always based on drawings that I've done in life, whether I'm on my kayak or I'm hiking in the Deering Estate. The figures, I have multiple studies of these figures because I want to abstract them. And then the cities, I have developed them from different maps, a combination of old maps and images from Google Earth that I mixed together. And so you can see this is a charcoal drawing of Maracaibo in Venezuela. And then this is Venice, for the Venice, Venezuela, which that's the study for that. And you can see the accuracy. There's the Rialto Bridge, there's the Grand Canal, there's St. Mark's Square and the Bell Tower, and there's even Murano and Burano back there. And then you have the city that I spent part of my childhood in, Paris, but it's a east-west oriented map. I mean, the north-south is turned on its side, and there's Ile de la Cité, and I loved it because it's when Paris was a walled city. So you can see these I do, that then they're transferred to large paintings. Everything that I use, one of the things that I absolutely love about Picasso is that reality or a photograph, anything is a starting point for him to process it internally to create his own presentation and vision of something. And I always try to do that. I want it to be a unique perspective. But this is, again, I have a longstanding relationship with the LNS Gallery. It's a space that you should know. And they're open to the public through reservations because of COVID. But you see these works here.
John,
and yes.
Oops, sorry to interrupt you. Just a couple more questions are coming in from our viewers, and a lot of it is around your international travel. I know that you have been in Miami. You've been showing kind of how you've been doing a lot of complex research here in the city. But one question comes from Sarah Hoffman, and she's wondering, what are your next adventures? What are your future plans? And also, there was a question to elaborate a little bit more about how you were able to go to the Louvre during the pandemic.
So my first thing is that I plan to go to France this summer again and spend the summer there painting and going to the museums that I can. And one of my dearest friends that I went to graduate school with, Stephen Meek, who is also a painter, lives in Rome. And I'd love to somehow get to go and see him and see Rome at this time. But definitely to go to paint in Lyon, because it was such a powerful experience for me the last summer. The way that I was able to go to the Louvre is I have very dear friends, Vincent and Nathalie, that live in Paris, an art historian and an artist. And I told them that I was coming to Paris, to France. And they said, well, the Louvre is just opening up again, but you have to get reservations. So I got a reservation and I saw that 9 a.m., right when it opened, was available. And I had an annual membership to the Louvre. So I was able to skip everybody with that membership. And I know the layout of the Louvre so well because I've been there so much, because I've, as a painter and also teaching, that I knew exactly where to go in and where to beat anybody else that was going in. And so I quickly went to the Mona Lisa. I saw that I was alone in that room with the Mona Lisa. And then I knew right away, okay, this is where people are gonna come. So then I went to see the Géricault, Wrath of the Medusa, and the De la Croix, Liberty, Leading the People, completely alone in that room. Then I went to see the Caravaggios and the was it that. And then so on Nathalie, I met them and we went to the Musée d'Orsay, and I was alone with Monet's cathedrals. And it was kind of just some art addiction moments that I'll never, ever forget.
That's awesome. So I have one last question from a viewer, Elizabeth Pino. She's asking whether you ever feel conflicted through representing Miami culture through a sort of European mythos.
Absolutely. So that's one of the things that the paintings aim to tackle head on. So I teach this class Miami in Miami. And so the dilemma that I face in teaching my class is reflected in the painting. So I am a white male born in Europe. And when I teach the history of Miami, I'm going to talk about the fact that the Tequestas were completely displaced. They essentially no longer exist as a people. I'm going to talk about how the lighthouse on Cape Florida, on Key Biscayne, was also put there to stop the Underground Railroad movement of slaves, escaped slaves that were going to the Bahamas. I'm going to talk about all these things, but it makes it awkward for me to be the one that talks about these things. And so I had two choices: to not talk about it, or to just talk about it and deal with the consequences and let me talking about it actually be part of the conversation. And I decided to go for the second. And it's the same thing with my paintings. So there's so many issues about actually somebody born in Europe about the indigenous people of the Americas, right? And celebrating them. And in a sense, it's so hypocritical because I'm part of the movement that destroyed them. But that problematic aspect of doing that is central to the paintings, because again, they're reflection on all of us being part of the problem and part of the solution. So the only other option is to pretend it never happened or to not talk about it. And that to me is a greater crime than anything else. And so I decided early on in my teaching and in my painting that I'm going to tackle everything, and the difficulty of engaging these topics is actually part of the process.
That's great. Thank you so much, John. It's been such a privilege to have you join us today. And we look forward to more programs and more opportunities to hear you speak. As John said, please go check out his work at LNS Gallery. Also, again, he is an artist in residence at the Deering Estate. Though the studio is currently closed to the public, keep in touch with the Deering Estate, because you can go there and see other things that are happening. It's a really lively place, and you might run into John while you are there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you all for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you. Ciao, ciao.